Washington Journal continues.
Here to discuss events concerning North Korea, nuclear capability, and the U.S. response are two guests. Anthony Ruggiero of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He serves as their senior fellow. We're also joined by Ivan Eland of the Independent Institute. He's their senior fellow as well as the director for the Center on Peace and Liberty. Both of you gentlemen, good morning.
Good morning.
Can we start with the information that we've received concerning the nuclear capability of North Korea? First of all, about their capability to put it on a missile. Do you believe that information? And if so, what does it mean? Mr. Eland, you go first.
Well, I have no reason to doubt it. I think the intelligence community seems to be inclined to believe that, and I think also Japan has said that they believe that they probably have that capability. I don't think that's the be-all and end-all, because they still have some other steps, like getting the re-entry capability. The missile has to go back through the Earth's atmosphere as our space capsule did. They had to withstand the heat of re-entry. So I think that's one thing that they still have to do. There may be others as well. So it's one step along the way. I wouldn't say that the crisis is as severe as the hype in the media has led us to believe. It's one step closer. They are getting closer. I think the horse is nearing the door to the barn.
Mr. Ruggiero?
Well, I agree. I think the hype is a little overplayed right now, but North Korea has been working on its nuclear weapons program and its long-range missile program for over 20 years. So it's not surprising what we're seeing. I think that we have a tendency to underestimate what North Korea is capable of. So maybe they have the miniaturization. They probably have re-entry vehicle technology. I think there's some dispute in the technical sphere of whether it actually broke up. The last test broke up. So it's still to be determined.
So if the hype is overplayed, then what about the reaction then from the president yesterday? Was that overplayed as well?
Well, I think we have to remember that our history with North Korea, that we were close to the brink of war in the 1990s, and we came back from that. I think that North Korea also realizes that they're not going to attack the United States with a nuclear weapon, because that would be really the end of their country. So I think that that this is about deterring. The president's words are about deterring North Korea, which has had a history of lashing out against South Korea. 7 years ago, they sunk a South Korean Navy vessel, and really to compel China to do more.
Mr. Eland?
Yeah, I don't think this rhetoric is helpful on the president's part. If you remember how Eisenhower handled these things, he was very careful about the rhetoric, and he downplayed any crisis, and he was very successful in managing crisis. If you actually hype the crisis, you can run into things like John F. Kennedy did when he thought the Russians had agreed not to put missiles in Cuba. So he made this fiery speech saying this would be unacceptable if they did, because he thought he had an agreement. Well, of course, then he was pinned into a corner, and he later even said that if I had made that speech, we wouldn't have this, we wouldn't have to do the things in this crisis. So I think presidents can get out ahead of their rhetoric, even if they are planning on taking military action, which I hope they're not. Rhetoric like this doesn't help. You should be speaking softly and carrying a big stick, as Teddy Roosevelt used to say. But I see no reason for this type of rhetoric at all.
So our guests will be joining us throughout the hour to take your calls on North Korea and the situation there and what's happened over the last day or so. And if you want to ask them questions, it's 202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, and Independents, 202-748-8002. So if, aside from military actions, as far as diplomacy or de-escalation, what does the United States have as options on that front, Mr. Eland?
Well, I think you have diplomacy and sanctions, which we've been doing. And I think Trump, despite his bluster, is continuing largely the Obama program. I think that, they are publicly pressuring China more than Obama did, but largely it's still negotiation and trying to tighten down the sanctions with North Korea. But I think we're going to have to accept the fact that they're going to get nuclear weapons. They're going to get a missile that can hit the United States, and we're going to have to deter them, just like we deterred radical Mao Zedong in the 70s, or excuse me, the 1960s, when he got a nuclear weapon. He threatened to nuke the United States, and there was a lot of talk during the Johnson administration of whether they ought to take him out. And Fortunately, they didn't. But I think, you know, you could have a pretty severe war on the Korean Peninsula, and we've got allies in Japan and South Korea, and even U.S. bases could be threatened in those countries. So we have to be careful what's going on here, and I think this rhetoric hasn't helped it.
And so as far as continued diplomacy and sanctions even being part of that, Mr. Ruggiero, how effective would that be, do you think?
Sure, I guess I'm the optimist here. I think that we don't need to look at military action. We don't need to fall back to deterrence right now. We haven't really tried sanctions. We have a successful case with regard to Iran. We're not even anywhere close to that. You know, I think that the suggestion that the Trump administration has continued the Obama administration policy is not correct. The Justice Department in particular has gone after Chinese banks that are doing transactions through the United States on behalf of North Korea. Recent revelations have shown that since 2009, Chinese banks have done at least $2.2 billion worth of transactions through the United States on behalf of North Korea. We also know that North Korea is not the most sanctioned country in the world. So there's a lot more that we could be doing and we should be doing, and it really starts with China. It starts with this new resolution. The question is this new resolution going to lead to a robust sanctions campaign, or is it the Chinese, again, sort of delaying U.S. action?
On the topic of our own capability of nuclear weapons, the president tweets out this morning, and this just recently, saying that my first order as president was to renovate and modernize our nuclear arsenal. Is now far stronger and more powerful than ever before. Hopefully we will never have to use this power, but there will never be a time that we are not the most powerful nation in the world. What do you think about those statements in light of recent actions of the last day or so?
Well, I think he's directly relating to our nuclear weapons, which most presidents would probably try to avoid. And I think, you know, the sanctions that we're putting on, they're probably unlikely to work. I mean, this is very important for North Korea. And the reason they're getting these weapons is because they feel threatened. And there's actually some reason for that. I mean, the United States continues to take out regimes. You know, we took out, in the old days, we took out Noriega, Cedras in Haiti, Milosevic, and more recently we've taken out Saddam Hussein, who didn't have nuclear weapons. And we actually made the folly, you know, the Obama administration, of taking out Muammar Gaddafi, who had agreed to give away his nuclear program. Now, what does that say? Would you get into an agreement if you gave up your nuclear weapons and then you got taken out anyway? The case of Libya is a stark historical reminder that perhaps this guy isn't crazy, perhaps he's eminently rational. And if he did get these nuclear weapons for that reason, then you can deter him, because his major goal by getting the nuclear weapons is regime survival, and his major goal will be to avoid a nuclear war, because we have a lot more warheads. We have thousands of them, and he has a few, right? And we don't even know if they're operational or if they can make them operational. It seems like they can now with the tests, but you know, I think he's eminently deterrable, and I think that's what we're going to have to do, because I just don't think the sanctions are going to work.
Mr. Ruggiero?
Well, I think it's important to point out that critics and supporters of the Iran deal both agree that sanctions brought Iran to the negotiating table. Those are the kinds of sanctions we have never tried with North Korea. In May, Secretary Tillerson said that sanctions pressure is a dial, and it's at 5 or 6 in May. The United States could turn it to 30 tomorrow, and the North Koreans will have to choose. They're not using their money for their people. They're using it for the military, to buy luxury goods for their elites, and for these programs. What happens when Kim has to decide between those three, and then the military comes after him, or his elites, or he can't continue those programs? It's sort of a simple math problem from that perspective. I think it's important also to point out that there's some North Korea propaganda in terms of the hostile policy rhetoric that they always put. I'll just say 2 things on that. The first is that most of the examples that people provide, especially North Korea, on why North Korea should be afraid of the United States, all come post when they started their nuclear program, and certainly after they started their nuclear weapons program. And then second, people forget that in the George W. Bush administration, in the 2005 rounds for the 6-party talks, the U.S. provided an assurance that we could peacefully coexist. That wasn't good enough for North Korea. So the question here really is not so much should we stop our hostile policy, but what does North Korea really want? And what they really want is to be acknowledged as a nuclear weapons state. So
we'll start our conversation with our viewers with our first call, who is from Bob. Boston, Massachusetts, independent line. Bob, you're on with our guest. Good morning.
Oh, good morning. I just have basically a comment there. You know, there's over 50 countries that have a nuclear bomb, so it's clearly deterrence is not working. I think it's time for all the nuclear scientists of the world to start exchanging notes there, and so there won't be a nuclear holocaust. And I think, the way to the future is nuclear energy. It's probably time to start putting the nuclear reactors in the center of the continental plates and make the continental plates as our governing zones. And that's what do you think about that?
Thanks, Bob. Mr. Eland?
Well, I think it's wrong to say that nuclear deterrence hasn't worked. We haven't had a nuclear attack since Hiroshima, and I think deterrence does work, and we have more weapons than North Korea does, and they're a very small, poor country, and they are reacting to us because this didn't start. Their fear of the United States didn't start with Libya or Iraq invasions. If you'll recall, the Indian chief of staff, they asked him after Desert Storm, which is in 1991, what he learned. He goes, if you want to keep the United States get nuclear weapons. So this has been a long running. Now, I'm not saying that's the only reason North Korea is getting these. I think their prestige is a factor simply because they don't have much else. They have a communist economy which doesn't work. They're a poor country, and they want to get attention. So that's one reason too. But I don't think we should dismiss the fact that they may have security fears, whether they're paranoid or not. They do have fears, but I think deterrence does work. I don't think he's crazy. His behavior hasn't been crazy. It's been radical. It's been thuggish in his own, by liquidating some of his own people, ruthless, etc. But I think the North Koreans have always been rational. And if they're rational, you can deter them.
Mr. Ruggiero.
Well, I think on deterrence, it seems like we're not there yet. I think that that's an area where we don't need to go to just yet. I think that recognizes North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. As I said earlier, I think there are a lot of options we can pursue before that. I think it also relies on being able to deter someone like Kim Jong-un. Like, I certainly don't think he is crazy, but I would not want to bet on him not using nuclear weapons against the United States. I think that our goal here should still be to denuclearize, whether it's with this regime or a successor regime, and there's a way to do that. We have the Iran sanctions model, and that's the way forward.
From Virginia Beach, Republican line, Bill, you're next.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. Your question is, what options does the U.S. have regarding North Korea? Of course, by far the best, I think, would be to choke them economically with sanctions, directly or indirectly through China. But on the assumption that the sanctions do not ultimately work, how confident are your two guests in the capability of the United States in hitting the point of release of ICBMs both before and after launch? That would be the next step, I would think, in deterring North Korea from hitting any part of the United States. Thank you.
Mr. Ruggiero, you start.
Sure. I mean, at the tail end of your question on counterforce with North Korea's programs, I think the issue there, which there are U.S. military officials who say, of course, there are military options, but the back end of those show the type of casualties possible, and part of that is because North Korea has a missile force that is a lot more mobile now. That we're not talking about 10 years ago where they stacked a missile on a tower for launch. In terms of, and as I've said, I don't think we need to get to that point right now. In terms of economic sanctions, I mentioned the $2.2 billion number. The fact remains that China its companies, its individuals, and its banks are facilitating North Korea's sanctions evasion, but our allies are not helping either. We have allies in the Middle East who are employing North Korean overseas laborers. North Korea gets $500 million a year from that. The UN itself has said that that money goes to the nuclear weapons and missile programs. In Singapore, there's a company that sells luxury goods to North Korea. In Europe, there was a company in Austria that sold ski equipment to the ski resort. Obviously, North Korean people are not going to a ski resort, so that's a luxury good. In Africa, countries are working with North Korea. So this is a global effort, and what is required, frankly, is that the Treasury Department and the State Department here in the United States needs to go around the world, privately and publicly, like we did with Iran, and tell people that you either dealing with North Korea or you're dealing with the United States, but you can't do both.
Mr. Eland.
Yeah, I think the problem with sanctions is enforcement. It always has been, because people have an incentive when the price gets bid up and illegal things, the price gets bid up, of making money. And all these people that are cheating are making money doing it, or it's very lucrative, and that's the problem. And I think you do have a little bit of a constricted situation with North Korea, since China accounts for 85% of its trade, both in and out, roughly, and also the Chinese banks, as has been pointed out, are facilitating a lot of lending and that sort of thing. So you do have to work on China. The problem is, I think China has two major disincentives for cooperating. They don't want the regime to implode because then they could possibly have a U.S. allied regime on their border with military bases, intelligence facilities. If South Korea and North Korea reunited in the manner of Germany, and the South Korean government took over that space. The other thing is, they don't want a lot of refugees running over their border if the regime collapses. So they have an incentive not to really tighten down on North Korea. Now, I think they're getting more nervous about North Korea's behavior than they've been in the past, but I think you still have the problem with China. And if Trump can get some lever over China, sanctions might be able to at least have an economic effect. But the problem is, North Korea is going to resist, because this goes to the security of the regime. Economic sanctions are good for some things, but achieving major political goals is what you're trying to do. And in this case, denuclearizing and getting rid of their missiles is very important to North Korea. And I think they'll resist, as they have been resisting sanctions all the way. So I'm not sure that sanctions are going to be successful. But, they're trying them, and that's certainly better than military action, I suppose. But we have to watch it, that sanctions, as in the first Gulf War, can escalate into military action, because people say, well, those didn't work, now what, right? So
what's the best way to view the fact that for the UN sanctions, that both Russia and China backed those? What's the best way to interpret that?
Well, they have to enforce them. There's been a long history in economic sanctions of countries saying, oh, we're going to do this on one level, and then under the table they make a lot of money cheating. So, I mean, OPEC is the standard model for that. That's not a sanctions, but it's a cartel, and they all pledge that they're going to meet the price, and they all export oil underneath. And sanctions is just an international cartel. If you can get an international cartel, that's the ideal. If it's unilateral sanctions, are only usually symbolic, unless the country has a really tight relationship. Now, unilateral sanctions of China against North Korea, that might do something, but you have to get the Chinese to do it.
Mr. Ruggiero?
Well, I mean, I agree with a lot of points. I think that China and Russia value their relationship with the United States. They want to do transactions through New York and U.S. dollars. That, I know there are a lot of disadvantages of sanctions, but that's an advantage to the United States. That's leverage. If we are willing to threaten and in some cases take that away, then that will get compliance. I think it's important to, I'm in these discussions about North Korea, I remember working in the U.S. government in 2010, conversations about Iran will never succumb to sanctions. We could never go after Iran's oil revenue. Iran will never go to the negotiating table. And regardless of what people think of the outcome of those negotiations, all those things happen. And they happen because you had a foundation of UN sanctions, and overlaid with robust U.S. sanctions, that were passed by Congress and implemented by the executive. And that's really what has to happen here. That has never happened on North Korea in the 11 years that we've had UN sanctions.
Gamba from Greenbelt, Maryland, Democrats line. You're on with our guest. Good morning.
Good morning, sir. My own take with this thing with North Korea is like America shouldn't go there solely. I'm not ruling out war, but for now we shouldn't go there. Say we're going to fight North Korea just all by ourselves. No, we should involve the allies. If we're going to go in there and fight, but that should be the last option. And the sanction has been not been effective. To be sincere with you, the sanctions need to be tightened up. Because since the sanctions have been levied on North Korea, it's like they are not working. And with China, it's like China is playing a double role here. China is behaving to America like they are with America, but trust me, behind closed doors, they are not with America. They're helping North Korea. So it's like China has to be talked to, like, look, stop all the devious, the clandestine moves we are on with North Korea. If China stops, trust me, North Korea will not go anywhere. But I believe the last option should be to go into North Korea and fight. And we shouldn't go there just by ourselves. We should involve the ally, go into North Korea. If they don't stop, that should be the last option. But now that shouldn't be the option for now. Let's still engage them with a peaceful resolution.
So taking from his question aside, let's say from Russia and China at this point, who are our strongest allies on this front as far as North Korea?
Right. I think the Trump administration could put together a coalition of like-minded countries, starting with South Korea, Japan, Australia, UK, France, and Germany. And what that group should do, and again, I keep referring back to Iran because it was successful and it worked, is very similar to what happened with Iran, is that coalition could take the UN sanctions and frankly US sanctions and implement those and go to countries and say, not only will you lose access to the US dollar, you're going to lose access to these other markets as well. And that will start to turn the tide. There are some countries who need help. They need assistance in finding the relationship with North Korea, because North Korea is very good at hiding it. Others are just not interested. They want to do business with North Korea, then they're not going to be able to do business with us. I would just say on the UN sanctions and another sort of point on sanctions not working, I agree 100%. They're not working. One example is the UN panel of experts, which is specifically charged to evaluate UN sanctions, has said that non-North Koreans are facilitating sanctions evasion. Who was designated in the recent resolution? Only North Koreans. That indicates that the UN itself is not even listening to its own sanctions implementation reports.
Mr. Eland.
Yeah, well, I just reiterate the fact that sanctions are difficult, multilateral especially in enforcement, and unilateral are usually only symbolic unless you have a really, exclusive relationship with a particular country or dominate the trade as China does. But so I don't see sanctions as the be-all and end-all. I think the Iranian example is a little bit optimistic about sanctions. I think there are other factors leading to the suspension of the nuclear program. And of course, I think the suspension of the Iranian nuclear program is a good thing. However, I'm not sure that sanctions was the be-all and end-all in that case either. I'm skeptical that sanctions even tightened sanctions are going to work. So I think we have to reach a conclusion. Well, what if that doesn't work? Then I think we have to accept deterrence. And I don't think one thing I think that we might agree on is that the military action is precipitous and ill-advised at this point.
Guest joining us, by the way, Ivan Eland of the Independent Institute. He serves as their senior fellow. Previously, he served at Director of Defense Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, spent 15 years working for Congress on national security issues. A little bit about the Independent Institute. What is it?
We're a public policy think tank in Oakland, California, and we do all sorts of public policy, including national security policy, which is my area.
Anthony Ruggiero also joins us, a senior fellow from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, was a foreign policy fellow in the office of Senator Marco Rubio, served at the Treasury Department as deputy director, and then the director of the Office of Global Affairs in the Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes. That's a long title. A little bit about the foundation. What is it?
Thank you. It's a nonpartisan think tank here in Washington, D.C., and we work on issues related to the Middle East and counterterrorism and sanctions policy.
Again, both of our guests here to talk about North Korea, especially in light of the current last day or so with concerns over its nuclear program and U.S. response. We'll go next to Brian, Woodbridge, Virginia, independent line. Good morning. Go ahead.
Thank you for taking my call. Kim Jong-un, even though he may act insane and immature, he is basically trying to appease his hardliners in order to stay in power by getting prestige for standing up to the great United States and all that. I think of one of our leaders just overlook that childish behavior and just say, okay, we'll meet and talk, just like we did with the leaders of Iran who are willing to negotiate and stop their nuclear endeavors. You'll see a different Kim Jong-un because, after all, he's really just looking for prestige. He knows there's no way he can win a conventional or nuclear war with the United States. The whole doggone peninsula on both sides would have hundreds of thousands to millions of casualties. But he can gain prestige by being the strong man and not backing down and begging the United States to be entered into the world market financially and by prestige. He's jealous of South Korea, which is the southern part of the country. And the only way he can get prestige, he can't do it competing economically, but he can compete militarily. So if one of our leaders just say, okay, let's come on over to D.C., we'll talk about it. Just like when Dennis Rodman went over there, you'll see a whole different face of North Korea, and he won't be quite as belligerent.
The history of talking to North Korea about these issues, Mr. Ruggiero.
Well, I would say there's a difference between talking with North Korea and negotiating with North Korea. I do think that Secretary Tillerson missed an opportunity to meet with North Korea's foreign minister in Manila this weekend at the ASEAN Regional Forum. I think that would have been an opportunity for the United States to just explain to North Korea what's coming for them, more robust sanctions, and reinforce what Secretary Tillerson said in the public, that if you stop your missile tests, whatever other types of preconditions, we're ready to come back to negotiations. I think that would have been useful. But in terms of the history with North Korea, the history is not kind. That we have tried at least 4 times, some people count it 8 times, to try and have a negotiated settlement with North Korea, and at every single opportunity, North Korea has violated that. In 1994, we had the agreed framework. North Korea set up their covert uranium enrichment program, which was another pathway for producing nuclear material. In 2005, as I referenced earlier, we had the 6-party talks, which I was a delegate to, and then what we learned later, because Israel destroyed it, that North Korea was building a nuclear reactor in Syria. So unfortunately, when it comes to North Korea, there's no real evidence that they're going to abide by any kind of negotiated settlement at this time.
Mr. Eland.
Yeah, I think the caller made an interesting point that sometimes when we either threaten military action or impose more sanctions, it sort of has a rallying around the flag effect, that Kim Jong-un can get domestic points among his hardliners for standing up to the U.S. And he can also, of course, whip the population into more of a frenzy against the West. And certainly he controls all the information, everything, so the North Koreans don't get a lot of outside information, get almost nothing. So it's very easy for him to do. So there is a rally around the flag effect to sanctions or military threats. And some people say he's like a spoiled child. You should just ignore him. But it does get hard to do. Politicians have to, including Trump, have to appear tough to their own populations as well. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that as well. So there's always tempting to what should the United States do about this or that problem. I think Trump may have had a point during the campaign where perhaps our allies should be doing more for themselves in this region, and that horrified the foreign policy elite of Washington, of course. But the other, Japan and South Korea, are talking about getting weapons that could preempt North Korean nuclear weapons, or at least try to. But I think, our allies in South Korea and Japan, we've had these allies since World War II, and it's a different situation now. I was in a meeting with Secretary Rumsfeld when he was the Secretary of Defense, and he said, we should have pulled out our troops out of South Korea a long time ago. And he didn't ever said that on the record, but, this alliance, South Korea has 40 times the GDP of the North. This is not 1950 anymore, where the two parties were equal. And I think South Korea needs to take more initiative, and they're not going to do it if we keep racing over there every time they do a missile test and saying, well, making threats. So Trump speaks with one side during the campaign, and now he's taking the other side. But his foreign policy has always been like that.
I think we've had the THAAD missile system implanted in South Korea. Is that still the case? And what capability or what kind of defense does that provide?
Well, it provides some. Our own missile defense here at home isn't that great as far as the probability of hitting the missile. And I think THAAD gives you a probability on certain types of missiles, not necessarily an ICBM, but certainly the new president of South Korea suspended it, but now he's gone the other way, I think, after North Korea's tests and that sort of thing. So the missile defense is a very imperfect solution. It does provide something, and I think we should keep working on it. But
not a lot of confidence, though, you have in it.
I don't have much confidence in it. No.
Why is that?
Well, the national system, they've done studies that show the probability of kill is not that high. They always do these tests, but they're always under ideal circumstances. So even successful tests on missile defense, you have to say, can this hit in a real world situation? Now, the systems like THAAD for shorter range missiles and that sort of thing, I think are better than the national system.
Let me get your sense on missile defense and the capability the U.S. has.
Well, I think I agree. I think that this is a system that still needs to be worked on. I think the theater and shorter range are more effective. THAAD is more directed at shorter and medium range ballistic missiles. I think it was good to see the South Korean president deploy all of the launchers. It was unfortunate that he stopped the deployment, for an environmental study that I guess doesn't mean as much now, given that it's a North Korea missile threat. I think we have to keep in mind that we have U.S. troops on the peninsula, and when the South Koreans make decisions about missile defense, it affects not only their citizens but ours as well.
Let's go to Dora, St. Petersburg, Florida, Democrats line.
Yes. I'm with the other guy that talked, the Democrat. But anyway, Mr. Trump don't have a policy. He don't know nothing about foreign.
Oh, Dora, I think we've lost the line. So if you want to give us a call back, please feel do so. As far as her thought about a policy, have we seen some type of direct policy for North Korea other than what we've heard rhetorically?
Well, the stated policy is maximum pressure and engagement, and I think that we've seen the elements of maximum pressure going after some of the elements of China that I described before, but it's an escalation ladder, and we're really at the bottom rung. And so, how many more times are we going to move up that ladder? I would argue that we need to do that immediately. On engagement, it's really hard to engage when you have the other party that continues to do missile tests. Probably it will do a nuclear test at some point, and has stated very clearly that they're not interested in negotiating their nuclear weapons and missile programs. So it's very hard to try an engagement strategy when the other side is not really willing to engage.
Mr. Eland.
Well, I think, we don't have maximum pressure yet, of course, and very frankly, if Trump wanted to do that, he could really tighten down on China and said our whole, trade relationship is going to be based on whether you help us out with North Korea. Now, whether you really want to do that or not is another matter, and I would caution against that. I think certainly you can pressure China to do more, but the president has been very satisfied with that, and he said so publicly on Twitter that he was hoping that they would do more. But as I mentioned earlier, there are a couple of reasons that China has no incentive to do that. So China, I think, is still the key. You can put multilateral sanctions on, but this trade relationship is fairly unique. 85% of the trade goes through China, and a lot of the financing and loans go through China. And yeah, of course, you can tighten down on the extraterritorial sanctions with Chinese banks. You say Chinese banks can't operate. We're not going to let them do anything in the United States if any Chinese bank goes, helps North Korea. But of course, that's a pretty drastic sanction. And you also have to, if you put a lot of economic sanctions on, and the United States is the premier user of economic sanctions because we feel that we have to, any problem in the world is ours to solve, but it undermines your own free market and your own reliability as a trading partner. If you're continuously saying, well, this political issue, we've got to put sanctions on, and people say, well, we'll shy away from trading with you. And that does undermine the system of international finance and commerce. So you have to, that's another, anytime you put sanctions on, you have to recognize those larger issues. And I don't think our government does enough of that.
Let's talk next to John in Louisiana, Republican line.
Yes, good morning. Unlike the two gentlemen there in the think tank, I was in a do tank. I spent 25 years in the Strategic Air Command, whose business was to engage in global nuclear war. We had forces, the triad of the sea-launched ballistic missiles, land-based ballistic missiles, and the aircraft. I was in the aircraft business. Now, that was when there was the Soviet Union, a rational-led country, and the United States. And those were the two nuclear superpowers. I think what we need now is to have a policy that does basically the same thing, is that as irrational as we may think North Korea is, there still has to be a degree of rationality where they fully understand, just like the Soviet Union, even though the Soviet Union struck us first, that was part of our policy. We would not make the first strike. The nuclear retaliation would be such magnitude that it deterred that first strike. And I think what we need to do is perhaps use a little bit of that knowledge we learned, because it worked. We did not have a nuclear war. We did not have a nuclear strike, but we were prepared to do it. And I think that has to be shaped to fit the scenario we have with North Korea. We still have those assets, I'm sure, available. I'm not personally knowledgeable of it. I retired 25 years ago. But nuclear war is nuclear war is nuclear war. It's a war. Yes, it's a horrific war, but it's still a war. And sometimes it is appropriate. And I think in what we have today is we have to establish what we had in form with the Soviet Union at North Korea to get them to understand you cannot have nuclear weapons.
John, thank you very much. Mr. Eland.
Well, I think the caller's right. That's basically what he's saying is deterrence, and you got to make deterrence viable. If you want to privately threaten the North Koreans and say, listen, in no uncertain terms, if you threaten us, we're going to retaliate, and it's going to be bad for you, and you have a home address, and unlike terrorists, you can be deterred, and we will incinerate your home address because we can find you, and we know where you are. That's fine in a private manner, but I think the president, by making these blustering statements, he's sort of maybe backing himself into a corner where he really has to do a preemptive strike, and I think that's very dangerous. As I mentioned, the episode of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when things get very public, leaders are forced to do stuff to satisfy their own bases, their own public, their own government sometimes. And so deterrence will work, but I think we need to express this more privately to him. And I don't think he's irrational. As I mentioned before, he does have a home address, and his behavior has been somewhat rational. I think, as I said, he's quirky, he's erratic, but I see no reason to believe that he's any less rational than Chairman Mao was in the 60s.
Mr. Ruggiero.
Well, I agree. I think Kim is rational, but he has bouts of irrationality. Killing his own brother, half-brother, in a public airport with a nerve agent. He has other bouts of irrationality. I think that, deterrence is not the strategy now. I have confidence in our military leaders that they have plans for either to respond to a nuclear strike by North Korea or, as has been described, unfortunately, in the public, preemptive or preventative strikes. The issue here, I know that there's a lot of questions about private messaging. As I noted, I think Secretary Tillerson should have met with the North Korean foreign minister this weekend. But North Korea is the one also, let's keep in mind, that has closed all these avenues to communication. They don't communicate through the demilitarized zone. There was a channel in New York that U.S. and North Korea used. It's called the New York Channel. It was closed by North Korea in July 2016. So we have to be clear that when we're talking about don't send public messages because we should be sending messages in private, it's back to the whole you need two to tango here. And North Korea is cutting off a lot of these avenues. So perhaps public messaging is the only message, and maybe that's the way to interpret the president's message, which is don't cross this line. Now, I think we have to be careful about also describing it as a red line or that the president has painted himself in the corner. I think that's equally dangerous than escalating rhetoric. We don't want to have a scenario where we feel like the United States or North Korea feels like they must respond. So I think we have to tamp down the rhetoric and then move back to solutions here.
Let me tap both of your experiences in Congress then. What's their role in this situation, particularly as of the messaging that you heard and you referenced yesterday with the president? What do you think Congress, we already seen Senator McCain critical of it. We've seen Senator Chuck Schumer critical of it and others. What's Congress's role here?
Well, I think that's right. I think they're gonna ask the right questions about why do we have this rhetoric? What is the strategy behind it? I think when we're talking about the policy, I know that people in Congress have, senators and congressmen have been asking the right questions about when are these sanctions going to be implemented. Some of them are mandatory, going after China. What is the maximum pressure part of the policy? What is the engagement part of the policy? Certainly, folks on Capitol Hill should ask the question about why didn't Secretary Tillerson meet with the North Korean foreign minister? I mean, part of that problem when you don't meet with someone, especially an adversary, is that we have allowed China and South Korea to deliver that message for us. And frankly, I would not want South Korea, even though they're an ally, I don't want South Korea and China delivering U.S. policy. It should be the United States. And we're not going to fall into negotiations. I think that we have this sort of, aversion to talking to North Korea. You can talk to North Korea, but then say, we're not going to go into negotiations until you meet these steps. And North Korea will have their own steps, too. I think, we have a tendency here, especially in Washington and in think tanks, to negotiate North Korea's side, too. North Korea will have a list of demands for us, and then we have to decide whether we're ready to meet those.
Mr. Eland.
Yeah, I thought it was very curious that they didn't have that meeting either, especially after Trump had said, I'd be willing to meet with him the leader of North Korea face to face, which everyone I think thought was a little bit over the top. But now they don't take advantage of a lower level meeting. I thought it was curious. Back to your question, that was that I think the Congress can play a very useful role. And in fact, the Congress is playing a greater role in foreign policy and other respects like Russian sanctions and that sort of thing. And I think it's particularly a good comment by John McCain. He's a hawk. He's well established that he's no shrinking violet in these matters. And he basically said the president shouldn't have said what he said. I mean, the president basically implied that we were going to use nuclear weapons and threaten the country with nuclear weapons. Now, we haven't heard that in a long time, if we've ever heard it before. I'd have to think back if anyone got that close to it. But I think John F. Kennedy may be in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but that's very ill-advised to say things like that. Even if you want to make public threats, that's not a good one to make. We may not use nuclear weapons. We might try to take these out with conventional weapons, but of course that would create a war that would kill probably millions of Koreans. And so also the rhetoric here that somebody had a conversation with the president and the president allegedly said, well, the deaths will be over there, not here. That's irresponsible. If that was said, that's irresponsible. That wasn't a public statement by the president, but I believe there's a member of Congress that said that, Lindsey Graham said that he had conversation with Trump. And Lindsey Graham is a hawk, but I'm not sure it was good to report that conversation because this is a loose rhetoric. And I think that's what a lot of people fear, is that this president hasn't had much foreign policy experience and may get a little ahead of himself in some of this rhetoric that he's putting out.
Let's hear from Bob, York, Pennsylvania, independent line.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. I have a couple issues. I was on active military duty during the Vietnam War, and in January 1968, Korea took our spy ship, in essence, the Pueblo. And I know a lot of us that were on active duty were really irritated that we didn't take any action. That crew was tortured. They weren't let go until December of that year, of 1968. Here, 50 years in the future, we're still sitting here talking about think tanks. We're talking about presidents that won't take any actions. What have we done to take that region seriously? We've allowed them to build up their military. We've allowed them to build nukes. And now we're taking guff that they're going to be attacking, like Anderson Air Force Base in Guam. How much of this do we really have to take? And then we talk about sanctions. If we haven't taken sanctions in the past and taken this seriously, I don't care how many think tanks we have out there. Why are we doing something that's going to bring this to fruition?
Mr. Eland.
Well, I think we do have to examine the policy issues, and that's what think tanks do in D.C., in Washington, D.C., in other places. There are many times that people have served in the government and have experience as to what to do. And these types of actions, the reason we haven't done anything is because there are factors mitigating that. I mean, we got to the policy that we have because this is a difficult issue. And if you just want to go out and take military action, this is going to have tremendous consequences for a war on the Korean Peninsula, because Seoul is only 35 miles from the DMZ, which separates North and South Korea. So any sort of retaliation by North Korea could become quite serious, and the danger is that even a surgical attack would turn into a major war. The potential for escalation, I think, is there. So when we throw around things like, well, we should have done this or we should have done that, why is the de facto option always military? We seem to take military action all over the world, and I think some of our military action has exacerbated this. As I mentioned, we take out leaders. Well, if you're in North Korea, you see that over time, and you say, well, maybe I should get nuclear weapons because they may come after me someday. And I think the Libyan case is a particularly exacerbating factor in this current issue, because we took out Libya even after it had started playing ball with the West on terrorism, got rid of its nuclear program, et cetera. So if that presents very bad incentives to other countries watching that.
Mr. Ruggiero.
Well, I think going back in history here, in the George W. Bush administration, North Korea had a list of demands. Every demand was met, whether it was talking about peaceful coexistence, which was to get over the hostile policy. I remember long ago, North Korea was interested in economic development or energy dependency, right? They wanted more energy. So in the 1990s, the Clinton administration provided, we're going to build light water reactors for North Korea to have energy for their country. And then because that wasn't good enough, or they wanted to change their tune, they switched to this hostile policy. And then, as I said, the George W. Bush administration not only did that, they took them off the state sponsor of terrorism list, which are still not on, which is pretty amazing, and then on and on and on. I mean, the question here really is, and as I said earlier, North Korea is the one that is saying they're not interested in negotiating their nuclear weapons and missile programs. At one level, we have to believe them, and at a second level, it'd be nice to hear from them what it would take for this type of negotiated settlement. I just also want to talk, make a point about escalating rhetoric. I think that there's not a lot of people that look at North Korea propaganda and all the missile tests have gotten a lot of publicity, but what North Korea has done in their propaganda videos after that have not gotten a lot of publicity. And in most cases, after these missile tests, they have shown propaganda videos, whether it's destroying the Capitol, destroying San Francisco, or destroying all of the United States with a nuclear weapon. So I think we have to be very clear about what North Korea is doing on their own side in terms of escalating this rhetoric too.
Let's hear from Don in Amarillo, Texas, Republican line.
Thank you. I would like to ask why we, the United States, can't just shoot down these North Korean missiles when they rise above international waters over the oceans. They are the aggressor here, and they are threatening our territories and allies throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Don't we have the right to defend ourselves? Wouldn't this be an ideal opportunity to test our anti-missile defenses? We could do this without invading, attacking, or shooting anybody. I just don't understand.
Mr. Ruggiero.
Certainly, I think the United States has made clear that they've been watching these missile tests and missile test preparations. So going back to the July 4th ICBM test, and even before that, tests this year and tests last year, there was this sense that North Korea was moving, testing in different places, not testing in sort of traditional missile test areas within North Korea. And the question was, is the United States seeing that? And after the July 4th test, it was very clear, again, a leak, unfortunately, that the United States was watching for some time the preparations. So what that tells me is that the United States certainly has an option in their quiver if they wanted to use it to stop a test if they wanted to do that. Now, I think the issue there is that what comes next could be the same as a all-out war with North Korea. In other words, even though Kim is rational, if you're taking out a missile on a test pad or after it gets in, probably not international waters given how close the countries are, but outside North Korea's waters, there's still no guarantee that the next step won't be a full military conflict.
Mr. Eland.
Well, yeah, of course you have to hit their missile first, and unless you take it out on the launch pad, which I think is a lot more, provocative. But of course, the missile system that we have is not necessarily going to be 100%. So we could, if we don't hit the missile, we could be worse off as far as deterring North Korea. We tried everything with them. We tried bribing them. Before, as was mentioned, giving them aid, this or that, and I think that was a mistake. I don't think we should do any of that. And we sign agreements with them, and then they tear them up, and then we sign new agreements with them. If they're not going to keep them, then just don't do that. I think ultimately we're going to probably have to rely on deterrence to, as I've said on occasions before here, that nothing seems to work, and I'm not as optimistic about sanctions. And so I think messing with their testing could trigger a war. And I think deterrence, we've deterred, we have thousands of nuclear warheads. They have a home address. I see no reason why we can't deter them in the future.
Here is Don from North Carolina, Democrats line. You're on with our guest.
Good morning. Thank you for Washington Journal and your guest today. This is a very interesting discussion. There's been a lot of talk about sanctions and a lot of talk about nuclear war. We don't want a nuclear war. And we're talking about what can be accomplished by the United States and its allies with sanctions, maybe even sanctions against China if they're not going to cooperate because they have more leverage than we do in this case. But nobody ever talks about what can China do if we get too tough with them in terms of sanctions against us. I mean, we've had wars for years now, and a lot of the money for the wars is being lent to us by China. So I would like somebody to talk about, well, what can China do with sanctions that we would suffer?
Is there backlash potentially from China?
Yeah, well, I think there is. And I think, I've been a little suspicious that, Trump wants to use some issue to do protectionist measures against China. Well, here's an ideal issue right here. I don't know if he's doing that or not, but certainly, free trade is a two-way street, and you can, China could do a lot against us in trade. And if people like cheap goods coming in, they don't like to pay high prices, et cetera, you can hurt our economy as well. Certainly, free trade benefits everybody, and I don't like to see that relationship go downhill. In fact, I'm a unilateral free trader. Anybody like China that's currency manipulating or anything else, they're also hurting their economy as well. And so, China certainly could retaliate, and we could end up in some sort of a trade war with them and over this, especially if you have extraterritorial sanctions on their banks or take extraterritorial measures against them and say, you're not pressuring North Korea, so we're going to put restrictions on your steel, whatever. And of course, then that can escalate down the way to a trade war, and that would be very unfortunate, I think.
Mr. Ruggiero.
Sure. There's a tendency, I think, to go to the extremes between a trade war with China and status quo, which is really not addressing China's sanctions evasion, North Korea's sanctions evasion. It's important to point out the Trump administration went after a Chinese bank, a small Chinese bank, namely Bank of Dandong, for violating U.S. law. Everybody predicted before that happened that the Chinese were going to, retaliate. They were going to jump up and down. The Chinese response has been muted because the Chinese bank is a money launderer for North Korea. I would just point out that there are lower levels of actions you can take against Chinese banks. And again, I would point out in the Iran case, the United States fined European financial institutions from 2012 to 2015 over $12 billion for Iran sanctions violations. You use a fine against the Chinese bank, even the largest Chinese bank and the largest in the world, ICBC or Bank of China or other Chinese banks, and that will say that they are not doing the right thing in terms of compliance, and that will have a trickle-down effect. The Chinese banks will go to the smaller Chinese banks, and they will start to make decisions against North Korea. And North Korea will see that revenue start to squeeze, and then they will, as I said earlier, they will have to make a decision. Do we pay our generals? Do we get luxury goods for the elites, or do we continue these programs? They're not going to be able to do all three, which they can do now.
Bill from Minnesota, Independent Line, your last call.
We're the United States of America. We're the United States of Europe.
Bill, you're on the air. You're on. Go ahead.
Hey, I just want to say, are we the United States of America or the United States of Europe and Asia?
What do you mean by that?
I'm an Ojibwe. My ancestors go way back, and I believe in the United States of America. When we continue to bring people from Europe into America and we can't even help the ones in poverty in our country, there's something wrong there.
Okay, Bill, we'll leave it there. So as far as moving forward, or at least what you see are next steps by this administration potentially, what's a positive step? What's a negative step, Mr. Eland?
Well, a positive step would be to lower the rhetoric and to see, let's give these new sanctions time to see what they can do. And I'm pessimistic, but it would be better to go that route than blustering rhetoric about implying that you're going to use nuclear weapons against another country.
Mr. Ruggiero.
Well, a positive step would be going to China, giving them a very short deadline and saying if they don't implement these sanctions, we're going to use our own U.S. sanctions. I think a negative step would be jumping into negotiations at this time. We have no leverage and we'll get a bad deal again.
Anthony Ruggiero, the Senior Fellow for the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. DefendDemocracy.org is the website. And we've also been joined by Ivan Eland of the Independent Institute, where he serves as Senior Fellow and the director of the Center on Peace and Liberty. Independent.org is the website for that organization. To both of you gentlemen, thanks for the conversation.
Thank you.
Coming up, we're going to talk with Bruce Brown. He is the executive director of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. He will be here to talk about the Trump administration's crackdown on leaks. That conversation coming up next.